So we are proud to introduce a fabulous keynote speaker. Dr. Edward Barbier is from Colorado State University. He also has a very well-known international reputation, and he has a book. It's called The Water Paradox. I have a copy, and it's not yet even hit the bookshelves yet, so this is a collector's item signed over to Mary Lou. So grab her at the beer if you want the collector's item copy. The subtitle on this is Why There Will Never Be Enough Water, and then goes on to say, and how to avoid the coming crisis. So thankfully it has some thought-provoking ideas on how to avoid that. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Barbier.
Thanks, Sean. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Mary Lou Smith and the Poudre River Forum Committee for inviting me. And I have to confess that when Mary Lou first asked me to come and talk, I said, I really don't think it's a good idea because I don't know that much about the Poudre River. I've only been at CSU. This is only my second year at CSU. And so I felt that I'm in a room with 300 experts on Poudre River. What can I say? And Mary Lou said, well, I would really like you to talk about the global context of the problems we're here. And I said, okay, well, if you don't mind, I'll talk a little bit about what I discovered in my book and hopefully share it with you. And maybe some of these thoughts and ideas and findings will help your deliberations both today and then afterwards when you continue to deal with the issues of the Poudre River. So I want to open by saying my main message here is that you are not alone. The water issues that you are dealing with here with respect to the Poudre are found everywhere in the world. Not just in the West, although I'll talk a little bit about the West, but all sorts of regions and countries and economies are grappling with the same issues that you are. And I want to start by talking about Rome. Now, if any of you have been to Rome, Italy, you will know that one of the iconic features of this city is its public fountains. And these public fountains aren't just decorative, although many of them are beautiful. They're also public sources of free water. So it's freely provided water for all the citizens and for visitors. And it's drinking water, it's potable water. And some of the fountains go back to Roman times, the ancient Roman times, 2,000 years ago, with maybe some additions like replacing the spouts. And for 2,000 years, these fountains have always been running. Through all the revolutions, the natural disasters, the world wars that Italy's dealt with, Rome's public fountains have always been supplying water, and for free for anybody who wants to use it, except for one time. And that was in the summer of 2017. And during this summer, Italy was in the middle of its biggest drought that it's seen in modern times. And its farmers were really badly affected. And so the first time in 2,000 years, the solution to this problem was simple. Rome would turn off its fountains and divert the water to the farmers that needed it for drought relief. To me, this is a symptom of what we're facing here globally, which is a growing water crisis. And the statistics show us that about 1/3 of the world's population, 2.5 billion people, are already in water-scarce regions. By 2030, intense water scarcity is going to displace as many as 700 million people. By 2050, more than half of the world's population and about half of the global grain production is going to be at risk due to water shortages. And there's two aspects to the problem. There's the physical scarcity, which in this global map are the areas in orange and then, of course, pink going towards them. But there's also growing economic scarcity, which means to bring more water on board for more uses, that cost of that water is going to rise. So it's going to get more and more expensive in the purple areas to supply people with increasing demands for water. So we're facing a physical scarcity globally. We're also already seeing signs in many regions of the world, particularly in the developing world, where you have fast growing economies and populations, increasing economic scarcity. So what's going on here? Well, despite mounting evidence of a growing water crisis, what we're actually dealing with here is that the world is not mobilizing its vast wealth, its ingenuity, and its institutions to grapple with it. If water is available, why is it so poorly managed? Well, there's two reasons for that. The first one is that we persist in exploiting fresh water as if it's still abundant, even though the signs of scarcity are there. And secondly, most importantly, our policies, our governments, and our institutions were developed when water was abundant. So they're carryovers from that age, and yet we're dealing with rapidly increasing shortages and scarcity. So the implication is that if we have inadequate governance policies and institutions, these poor management tools are why we are not seeing rising economic costs being reflected in our policies and in our markets for water. And then on top of that, the water development that does occur because of this underpricing of water ends up with excessive environmental and social damages. And that manifests itself with water depletion, pollution, ecosystem degradation, and of course, water scarcity. But that's not reflected in our policies and our markets because the institutions, governance, and policies are all reflecting an age of abundance, not an age of scarcity. So the vicious cycle continues. And the result is what we're seeing more and more. Declining water security, impacts on growth, water grabbing, disputes and conflicts over water, and of course, inadequate water-saving innovations. So if we want to break this circle, and if we want to turn it into a virtuous one, we need to start with where the tools of management lie, and that's with our governance, our institutions, and our policies. And they must be now dealing in a world of water scarcity. And if we do that, then one of the things these institutions have to do is to make sure that the rising economic costs of exploiting water are reflected in our markets and policies. That will ensure that our water developments and our use will minimize the environmental social damages. That will lead to more conservation of water, control of the pollution that affects our quality, more protection of the ecosystems that provide the water, and of course, reducing water scarcity. And in this case, then we will see water moving towards more secure sources. We'll see support for growth. We'll see more innovation for water-saving innovations, and we'll also lessen problems of conflicts and disputes. Now, this is all nice theory, and it's the big dream, of course. But I want to give you some practical examples here to try and ground this a little bit more. And I want to talk about, because my time is short, I want to talk about three. There's more that I talk about in my book, and there's many, many concrete examples. I want to talk about water markets, the pricing of water and sanitation services, and river basin management, because I'm hoping that will be three areas that of interest to this audience. You've heard, as many of you, I'm sure, dealing with water issues, you've heard that water markets might be the solution. And that's increasingly being advocated in the US West, is water scarcity problems could be alleviated if we had better functioning water markets. And the reason is that water markets have the potential to improve the efficiency of water use by moving water from lower value uses, which at the moment tends to be irrigation, agriculture, to higher value uses such as municipalities and industries. And it would also address the problem that 80% of the water right now is in irrigation uses, whereas the fastest growing uses are going to be municipal and industrial, and then you can add environmental or recreational. And the argument is that both parties would gain if this would occur. In the higher valued municipal and industrial uses, water is valued as much as $200 per acre foot, whereas in agriculture uses, it's about $25. So as you trade water from farmers to cities, the cities would get water for less money than they're willing to pay for it. But farmers would also gain because they get revenues from selling their excess water, and they would be more efficient in their use of the remaining water. Why is that? Well, because the water would have a higher value because you could, again, earn more money by selling it rather than just wasting it. So if that's the case, why don't we see water markets everywhere? I mean, it sounds brilliant, right? And you know, talk to a lot of economists, and they say that's the solution, water markets. And but as you guys know, and I know, there's a lot of reasons that make this ideal not a reality. And one is that we have a lot of restrictions on water, particularly trading across states. Large volumes of water to trade across states is just very difficult. Where we see water trades taking place, they're more local or statewide. They tend not to be across state boundaries. And of course, water itself is very difficult to move from one location to another. The new uses of water aren't necessarily going to be in areas that are cheap to take water and get it to them. So conveying water is very expensive. We heard this morning about the long City of Thornton process of obtaining, and not just obtaining water rights, but actually using them. And there's a lot of legal uncertainty, a lot of red tape. There's a huge amount of changes that have to do with the way our legal use and definitions of water have to take place before we do that. What we call in economics transaction costs, the costs of actually making a deal or an exchange, or making a market work, is extremely high for water. And there's a lot of regulation that controls what we do. And if you add in trying to preserve water for in-stream use, we pile more regulations on for that. It gets it very difficult to sort out these different uses through trade. Now, the other thing you'll often hear is that it's the farmer's fault. They're reluctant to sell water, and we stop right there. Don't blame the farmers. Like any other actor in your economy and in your system, they're just responding to the incentives. Their behavior is responding to the significant legal, institutional, regulatory conditions that they find themselves in. And often what farmers find is that the current systems of institutions and incentives makes it very, very difficult for them to trade even if they want to. And what is more, we have a rather strange situation. And one way, if you think about it, we've actually, with our system of prior appropriation, separated water rights from land. So in theory, it should be easy to sell or trade your water if you have a use of it. But in practice, all these barriers and all these institutional constraints and so forth make it extremely difficult for farmers to do that. And as a result, rather than have an incentive to sell or lease their water to outside users, they only do this unless they plan to go out of operations, or it actually makes it to the point where they're unwilling to actually reduce their use of water because they might lose it. And we heard again this morning about the allocation of water from senior to junior rights, and how the people further down the rights stream, if you like, those close to the end of the senior and of course in the junior rights, they don't know whether they're going to have the rights. They may not have the rights depending on the allocations. And in any case, for many farmers, it may not be their right anyway. Some farmers, the right, if they don't use the water, it goes to the irrigation district. The irrigation district is the ultimate adjudicator of the right. And if that's the case, then the farmer's hands are tied. the farmer can sell to another farmer, but not necessarily to another user. And that's true for multiple farmers and users. Once again, this leads to not just inefficient and excess water use in agriculture, but also gives farmers the reluctance to parcel out water rights and try to sell any excess water they might have, even in abundant years. And of course, you add on drought and climate variability, you can see the reluctance to even further. It reinforces it. Despite all of this, water markets are spreading. Communities, organizations like yourselves, stakeholders, farmers, and other users are getting together and they're making trades. And a number of mechanisms have come up throughout the West. One is, of course, direct transfers, where you just buy outright the right. But we're also seeing increasingly indirect transfers, where users are going to irrigation districts and basically becoming part of the network or doing deals with districts to gain water resources. Even though the district retains overall right, other users are allowed in as part of the overall network. And then increasingly we're seeing leasing rights. That's where sellers retain the right for future use, but lease water temporarily for 1 year or multiple years. Another increasing innovation that you're seeing around the West in the United States is water banks, which is, I think, a very interesting one. Water banks are, just like the name implies, they're like banks. That essentially water owners of the water right, who are generally farmers, put their deposits of water, hold their rights in deposit at this bank. And they hold the water in there for future use. They could have the opportunity, the water is pooled by all the users, and they could have the opportunity to draw on that pool of water rights for future use under drought conditions. But that pooling of water, all these bits of excess water, and over time, can also be sold off to other users. So water banks gives the farmers as a collective group more control, and also protects them from their biggest fear, which is drought and water variability. And it also gives them the option to sell it to other users. So these are the various things that are being experimented around the West, and it's growing. And I want to share with you some studies. There's one economic study that was done over a long period of time looking at water trades, both between agricultural users and between agricultural and urban users. And this study involved over 3,000 trades from 1987 to 2005. And what they found is that these trades are working. They're more than they ever were before, and they're working in the way that we think water markets should work, which is that prices are higher for agriculture to urban water trades than they are from transfers between agricultural producers. More importantly, we're starting to see water trades for longer periods of time, either outright selling or moving from single-year leases to multiple years leases. So again, farmers are finding it both a gain for them and also in their interests to think more of the long term, and so are the buyers. And more importantly, the states with the highest urban growth appear to be making most of the water transactions. So that's good news. Now I want to look at the other end. I mean, so far I've been looking at water trades and talking a lot about farmers and their incentives. But let's look at the other end. The municipal industrial end of services, which is generally water services and sanitation. One of the biggest problems here is it's underpriced. And it's not just in the United States, it's around most of the major countries of the world. Governments typically pay a large share of the investment costs and also often subsidize the operating costs. And even in countries such as France and Japan, where the consumers are paying almost all the operational costs, the investment costs still aren't completely covered. And then here's the United States, of course, where this, of course, across the country, it varies from region to region. 50% government paying for the operating costs and up to 70% investment costs. So we need to move with managing the demand of growing urban areas and cities and industrial use. And ending this underpricing could do three things. First, it could improve cost recovery, which is badly needed. It could foster more water conservation by the users. And if it's designed in the right way, it could ensure better equity for low-income families, which is the big problem. To do that, to address the equity, to reduce the burden on low-income households, we need to think about a two-tier pricing system. A fixed service charge up to a certain amount of water use, and then a higher price for the second block of water use beyond that. And I think it's easier to show it in this diagram. So most typical poor households, low-income households in urban areas, they use about 20 cubic meters of water per month. So you could charge them a lower price. You could charge all households a lower price for that first use of water, which would be a lot of low-income households. But then you would charge a higher price for households that would use water above 20 cubic meters per month. So if you want to fill up your swimming pool or grow lemons in your backyard, you would be facing that price for that excess water you'd use beyond the basic services that you and other houses would. And that would help to reduce the burden. We could go a step further. We could instigate with the revenues earned from this programs like equivalent, you guys all may have heard of the Energy Star program for energy appliances. We could have a similar one for water, a Water Star program, where households would, particularly poor households, would get rebates for investing in water-saving domestic appliances and improvements in water use and so forth. We have some of those mechanisms in place, but often they're requirements and they're done on a very local basis. We could go bigger than that. We could also, you've heard of energy efficiency through insulation. We could have similar programs that help reduce leakages to households and neighborhoods, so forth, in the water system to reduce the problem of poor piping and problem. And of course, this has other implications if you think about the whole Flint, Michigan lead piping problem. The last thing I want to talk about, because my time is running out, is river basin management. And I want to focus on one study that looked at major developments that are occurring in river basin management in 4 areas. And one of them is in the Colorado River Basin. Now, the 4 basins they looked at in this study are the Colorado, the Yellow River in China, the Murray-Darling in Australia, and a complex that in South Africa, the Orange-Senqu River through Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, and South Africa. These are huge rivers, as we know from the Colorado. The river basin is also big. There was also, you could point to in all these cases, a catalyst for reform. Now we could, as the study shows, some of the reforms that have taken place are slower in certain rivers than others. There's a long way to go with Colorado, but at least there is beginning of coordination between multiple jurisdictions, and some starting to use some water markets, including water banks, to allocate water in some areas. The river that really has gone wholeheartedly for river basin management is the Murray-Darling in Australia. I'm not going to cover that here. I use it as a case study in the book. But essentially, they have a very extensive system of water markets. They have basically taken away jurisdiction of water away from the political units, the states, and given it to the river basin. So it has its own management authority. They've had to deal with all sorts of issues, and they're also planning for climate change and so forth. But here's what I want to share with you. The insights from this comparative study is that there seems to be a number of things that are keys to moving in this direction of thinking about a river-wide management possibility, even for these incredibly large rivers and river basins. One is that crises can be a catalyst for reform. In all these cases, there was one crisis or more that really led to it. In the Murray-Darling in Australia, it was a major drought. For those of you interested in in-stream flow, taking into account the valuation of ecosystem services is critical to just thinking about river basin management, and how to evaluate the trade-offs between consumptive and in-stream uses is really important, and using valuation for that purposes. It's not good enough just to talk about the consumptive uses. We have to look at the in-stream and then think about the trade-offs and actually try and value them and think about them. That's what's been going on in some of these areas. The water management plan should take into account the variability of the streams shared between water users and, of course, again, the in-stream users. Where water markets have been implemented, they have helped to reduce the cost of reallocating water. They're not the solution, but they have helped in the process of achieving efficiency. And of course, the contribution of centralized and nested water government structures within basin-wide management seems to be really important to resolving it. Now, I've only been here, this is my first forum, I've only been here today, but I have to say that based on your definition and based on what I've heard so far, you guys are on the right path. You've used this forum as a way of bringing the key stakeholders together. You're talking about these issues. Many of you probably know exactly, and I'm probably a lot more than I do about some of these things, particularly in the context of your river. And you're talking about the same solution, a healthy, working river. You're bringing all those elements that, you're starting to bring in all those elements that I showed you in that previous slide about where river basin management can take you. And you will get there. And I appreciate you coming to talk to me. One thing, though, we all share our agreement. This is a complex issue. You're taking your first steps, you're on your way. It's going to take a lot more steps. But I'm very optimistic from what I've heard today. What I don't want you to do is to end up with a simple solution like what happened in Rome to your water scarcity problems. Turning off water for one user and giving it to another. That's a simple solution to a complex problem, but it's also the wrong solution. You're working towards the right solution for the complex problem, and you're on your way. Thank you very much.
Hi, Dr. Barbier. I'm Trevor Even at CSU, and my question, you talked a lot about water markets and the difficulty of the different regulatory regimes in constricting those markets and their viability. And I'm curious, though, in your research and in your studies of different case studies around, if you could talk about some of the non-market mechanisms for water reallocation during times of stress that have been attempted, and maybe what some of those approaches might be as well.
Well, there's many ways of doing it. I mean, the alternative to markets has often been to regulate one use or another to try and use water. I mean, unfortunately, that has a lot of cost to it in terms of the overall restriction. So, for example, I mean, a classic response to water scarcity you'll see in city areas is to have things like hose pipe bans and you can't wash your cars and so forth. So that's a common sort of response. But that's changing. We realize that's only dealing with the crisis that it happens. The problems that you're dealing with and the problems that other regions are dealing with is a long-term process of managing growing demands as populations and economies and areas grow. More water. Everyone needs more water. At some point, we can't think about the problem solely as either finding more supply to meet those growing demands, or restricting those demands arbitrarily, rationing or bans or that sort of thing. We have to think more about, can we actually manage the demand so we can reduce per capita use and also improve the efficiency of the existing delivery, supply, and investment mechanisms. And we do that in so many other fields, but with water, for a long history, which I go through in the book, which I won't do, we don't have the time for me to go through here, we've not treated water in that way. And that's the legacy we're dealing with now in order to try to deal. So the alternative, I think, increasingly, if we don't start to move towards managing the demand, including using pricing and markets, is increasingly restricting. And to the point where we may actually have to make choices like they did in Rome, which is to say, sorry, you're not going to have your water for a while. You're going to have, it's going to be shifted somewhere else. We do that with brownouts and with electricity. We'll be seeing that with water coming to a neighborhood soon.
Edward, we're over here. There's a question comment behind the poll, so I just want to let you know it's not just a voice from the clouds.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Sean.
Yes, my name is Robert Longenbaugh. Many of you will know my experience as a professor at CSU and assistant state engineer. One of the things I've said here this morning and through the afternoon, and I'm greatly concerned that the Poudre River hydrology is more complex than it's been presented today.
Yeah.
One of the major sources of water that we need to manage and administer is our groundwater resource. I've not heard anybody talk about how that groundwater resource has been important in the past. One of the earliest areas in Colorado where large numbers of irrigation wells were constructed was the area between here and Wellington and over to Eaton and Alt. The amount of water that's in storage is thousands of acre feet. We need to manage the ground and the surface water together. And that's a complex thing to do. And in addition, hydrology is not steady state. It's dynamic, and it varies in time and space. And when you then make decisions or make planning strategies, you better be willing to look in both time and space and how Mother Nature still controls what's going on. I would seriously suggest to you that you put this kind of an agenda item on one of your next topics in how groundwater in the Poudre River Basin is a very important element and must be addressed.
Thank you. Thank you. I actually agree with your comments wholeheartedly. And I deliberated whether I should bring groundwater topic up into this. I usually do, and I do address groundwater. We have a groundwater crisis going on as well. It's not just about surface water. And the two are connected, as the gentleman pointed out. And what's worse is that our institutions for managing groundwater are further underdeveloped often compared to surface water even. In many states, Western states, there's no rights for groundwater. It's open access, so whoever gets it uses it first. And we often don't know what's down there. Increasingly, when a response, if you have access to groundwater and you are uncertain or you need to expand your water use and you're uncertain about your supply, farmers and others are increasingly tapping into groundwater as the alternative. It's the backstop that we're using. And because we have no protection for it, it's open access so everybody can get to it, it's a cheap alternative. But it won't be for long because the aquifers are also running out. And there's a connection between surface water use and groundwater use. And then finally, the variability, hydrological variability, I couldn't agree more. But that's why we have to think about managing demand. We can't just think about the supply and assume it's there and that it's always going to be abundant, whether it's surface water or groundwater. We have to think about how do we manage the ground and get more efficiency out of the use, the system and the water we already have. I'll end on that.